Hello, good afternoon. My name is Joe Capizzi. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. The IHE exists at Catholic University to educate university students, to give the Republic her best citizens, to sponsor multidisciplinary research on the intersection of human flourishing and Catholic social doctrine, and to organize events that encourage conversation between the academy and the public square. Today, you're joining us for our third session on the university and its the consequences that it's borne, the challenges it's faced in the light of COVID and other pressures that are exerting themselves in our culture. We're joined today by two IHE Fellows, two eminent professors in their own rights. First is Margarita Mooney, who's the Associate Professor of Congregational Studies at Princeton Theological Seminary, where she teaches classes on philosophy of social science, research methods, religion and resilience, and sociology of religion. She received her BA in psychology from Yale University and her MA and PhD in sociology from Princeton University. Margarita, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Margarita is also the head of the Scala Foundation, which is co-sponsoring today's session of our conversation. So Margarita, thank you so much for sponsoring this with us and with joining us. Why don't you say a little bit about the Scala Foundation?
Yes, I founded Scala in 2016 with the mission of renewing the liberal arts tradition. And as Scala has grown over the last 5 years, I think one emphasis that we try to bring out in the renewal of liberal arts education is a more of a medieval view of the university where beauty and art is understood not simply as subjective self-expression, but as objective knowledge, and integrating that beauty into the liberal arts curriculum across science, across a variety of different disciplines. So in brief, I would say Scala in some ways is combining the vision of John Henry Newman with insights from Saint Benedict and the Benedictine way of schooling with the scholastic philosopher Jacques Maritain.
Wow, fantastic. I paid a lot of attention to what you guys at Scala are doing, so it's really a pleasure to finally be working with you. This is really a thrill for us at the IHE. Our second guest today is a longtime colleague of mine and a friend, Michael Gorman. He's an ordinary professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America. His philosophical research focuses on questions of metaphysics and human nature, and he has a special interest in the idea that these concepts in these areas are irreducibly normative. He's the author of a book and many articles, and his BA is from St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. His PhD in philosophy is from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and he also has a PhD in theology from Boston College. Michael, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon as well. Don't forget to unmute. There you go.
Thanks so much. This is going to be fun.
It is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really glad that you guys can join us. And of course, to our guests, thank you for joining us for this third session. If this is your first session with us, we have two other sessions that you can access through our website. So I encourage you to look at those. If this is your third session, thank you so much for being a part of all of these excellent conversations. As always, submit your questions through the Q&A box because we're going to give you a lot of time for questions and answers at the end of our conversation, starting roughly around 2:40. So we're really, really pleased to have you guys with us. So for the final session, today we're going to be focusing on curricular questions. And that actually will, of course, open up wider conversation about the university. But what we're trying to discuss today is what we think are the curricular type questions that animate universities and whether COVID has had a kind of unintended consequence of accelerating certain pressures on these curricula as they express themselves in different universities and colleges. As I think anybody who's paying attention to this has seen, during the past 18 months, and of course, even during COVID more particularly, we've seen an acceleration of the demise of departments in liberal arts and humanities. Most recently, there's been pressure on the classics department at a university very close to Catholic University. Howard University, I think, has made the decision not to hire any longer in its classics program, which means it's more or less being phased out. These are trends that I think anybody who's paying attention to universities probably saw, in the offing, but they've certainly been accelerated and perhaps even deepened by COVID. So a question that we have that we're facing today is more or less like, what is the relationship of the curriculum to what a university is supposed to be doing? And Margarita, I'm going to start with you. The question I'm going to ask you and Michael to begin by addressing is there a kind of essence of a university that expresses itself in the matter of its curriculum? Is there something about what a university does that suggests that certain curricular pieces ought to be present? And how does the pressure on COVID, the pressure from COVID and other sources alter what universities are up to, or perhaps give us opportunities for thinking about what universities and colleges ought to be doing?
Well, sure. I think that really up until the 1960s, there was a lot of consensus that universities were indeed a university, a place where specialized fields of knowledge came together to form an integral whole, right? So the term liberal arts education refers to the possibility of integration across different fields: mathematics, sciences, literature, philosophy, theology. Now, this consensus changed, and I won't go into the whole history, but with the emphasis more on research and on technology and on specialization, which has been, of course, written about and critiqued by many Catholic intellectuals, what we've ended up with is a system of majors, of specialized fields of study. Now, in the past few years prior to COVID, there was quite a lot of interest in returning to a core curriculum. I mean, Catholic University, going back to a core curriculum, Columbia University has kept its core curriculum where all students study a sequence of literature and philosophy and theology. There are smaller schools like St. John's in Annapolis that has a great books curriculum. And also this core has come back in many forms in classical high school education and in homeschooling. Now, what happened as a result of COVID, I believe, or what we are seeing or shall see, is the economic pressure on many universities to sustain their model. And what I have come to see, because Scala has been promoting liberal arts education for the last 5 years, and I've had summer programs, and I taught a summer course through Pepperdine University in DC last summer, and we had policymakers there, and I attended other sessions with policymakers. And what I began to realize is that the model of liberal arts education at the university level, which I think Catholic University does a great job, Columbia, others that have a core curriculum, doesn't have to be the model for all Americans, right? There are many people for whom a high school degree plus a year or two to get a trade certification is sufficient. So, to borrow a term from Senator Ben Sasse, who got his PhD in history from Yale University and was the president of a liberal arts college, maybe what COVID is going to do is unbundle education. Universities, schools that go by the name of universities, now combine the curriculum, sports teams, study abroad, mental health services, all kinds of additional things. And so maybe the question then becomes, what is the core of a university, as you have said, Joe? And is there not a more economical way to deliver that core? And wouldn't it perhaps also be worthwhile to think about a core curriculum in the K-12 level, especially at the high school level? Because just because somebody's vocation is going to be as a mechanic or manual labor doesn't mean that they shouldn't be exposed to basic science, to literature, to history, to civics when they're in high school. This is what we did prior to 1960, right? So there's been an erosion of the high school curriculum away also from a liberal arts model. So unbundling and saying that not everybody needs a 4-year university degree is by no means saying that not everybody deserves a liberal arts education. I think liberal arts education is the only model of education for a free society. And it has to begin really beginning in kindergarten and going all the way up through K-12. So I have more to say about what I think is going to happen in schools such as Catholic University or Princeton or others that, of course, are going to survive the pandemic. The question for them is, what does it look like to rethink their commitment to the liberal arts, given the changes caused by COVID.
That's great. I mean, you've given us already a ton to respond to. Michael, why don't you take a swipe at the first, the global question that I presented you guys, and then perhaps we can start, our conversation among the three of us.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So I wanted to make sort of 2 points about what it would mean to focus on what's essential to the university in its essence, so to speak. So the first thing is, and I want to do this picking up on the idea of focusing on the curriculum, as you mentioned. So the first thing I want to say is that we have to recapture perhaps a focus on the curriculum, focus on things that are curricular as distinct from things that are extracurricular. Now, by the curriculum, I mean this in a somewhat broad sense. So not only the actual courses and degree requirements, although those are actually like super important, but there's a whole sort of paracurricular stuff, by which I mean like the whole setting of intellectual discussion and conversation, attending lectures that aren't required, hanging around, staying up until 3 o'clock in the morning talking about the meaning of life, that kind of stuff. And that stuff needs to be prioritized over all the other stuff that is like really extracurricular, by which I mean sports, exercise facilities, how good the dining hall is, sailing clubs, moon bounces, fireworks. Now, I'm not against these things. I really like fireworks, stuff like that, but they have to be subordinated to that, to the properly curricular stuff. And what that means, and this is a hard saying perhaps, not all divisions of the university are equal. Like there's this idea going around now, we're all employees here, we're all on the staff together, but actually the academic side is the leading part. Like the academic side is not a side, right? The academics is the center, and everything else has to be seen as subordinate and supporting. That has to be understood very clearly, and I don't think it always is. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is I was struck, okay, so I was trying to figure out like, how do we tie this into the COVID thing? The obvious thing is there's now this big financial crunch on it. So we have to decide about priorities. But one thing that I, like many people, I followed the disputes over how the country should respond to the COVID crisis. I followed them like more closely than I ought to have done. And I was really kind of shocked and scandalized by how poor quality the discussion was. I guess it was naive of me, but anyway, I was. So this had a properly intellectual side, but also a moral side. By the properly intellectual side, I mean, you just saw people just unable to understand basic mathematical things, very elementary things about causation and risk and stuff like that. Fine. But there's also, so to speak, a moral side. People were really mean-spirited. They were really angry, and they were often not very interested in finding out the truth, but instead of like shoving their own view forward. And if that results in provoking the other guys into saying more crazy things, that's great, because then I can attack them for the crazy things they just said. So there's this huge, sort of people provoking one another to take more and more extreme views. And so I was thinking that going forward, what this shows is that what we need is to recapture a sense of intellectual inquiry as a kind of theory. It's aimed at the truth in as disinterested a way as we can. So, and partly that means what we teach, but also it means sort of how we teach it. And on a very concrete level, as faculty, we have to sort of, I don't like using this as a verb, but we have to model being calm, truth-oriented people. We're interested in questions, we welcome questions. If we give an argument that's not very good, we're going to go, well, this isn't a very good argument, but it's suggestive. And if someone points out that we're wrong, we're going to go, oh yeah, I was wrong there, good. And things like this, so we can help students to grasp that there's another approach to things, where actually what you're trying to do is find the truth together rather than beat the other team. And I feel like this is something that we need now more than ever. So that's all I have to say at the moment.
Yeah, no, look, again, both of you guys have given us a ton to pick up on, and I'm going to try, I mean, typical moderator move, I'm going to try to pick up on something that actually I think is a possible commonality in some of your comments. And so the first is related to Margarita, your point about unbundling. You know, you're following Sass's point about bundling the university or education, excuse me, and making some distinctions perhaps in, you know, universities are doing the sort of the core type liberal arts thing, and those that may not be, and nonetheless not abandoning the idea that liberal arts is good for people, you know, more than simply those who might be at a university that's sort of centering itself around a core. And then Michael, your first point about, you know, the sort of paracurricular and curricular and extracurricular things. And as somebody who's a parent now of 3 and, you know, next fall 4 former or current college students, and Michael, you're, you know, more or less in the same boat as I am. Margarita, you're younger than we are, so you probably, you know, this is probably, you know, alien to you. But one thing that strikes me is what you're both describing is a kind of fundamental reorientation about the way we think of the college experience, right? This is a term that I'm sure, Michael, you've heard, Margarita, you've heard probably in your own research and just being around people too. I hear it all the time. You know, I really want my child to have the college experience, right? And in terms of prioritizations, that's almost always signaling what Michael described as the extracurricular stuff as the heart of the thing. And the curricular things, maybe that's secondary, and the paracurricular things are almost, you know, they're almost irrelevant to it. So I wonder to what extent, with what you're both describing, is what we need is a kind of real awakening to what possibilities are with regard to the college experience, that we might want to think about. We're challenging that conception, right? And there may be places that need to continue to pursue those, or it's appropriate to what they're doing, but there may be those that it's not appropriate to them. What, Margarita, does that sound right to some extent?
Well, here's my reaction to kind of Michael's comments, and I think to your question. I think the commonality between Michael and I is that we believe in an integrated curriculum, right? What we have now is a fragmentation between the classroom and the extracurriculars. What I want is not necessarily a subordination of the extracurricular or the co-curricular, but an integration. And what I've learned from doing Scala is that you can't address some of the problems that Michael described in the classroom if you don't build bonds of friendship and trust among students. This is why I've turned to the Benedictine model of education. This is why I've turned to kind of the medieval Boethian understanding of beauty as opening us up to desire the truth, and then creating communities of friends that seek the truth together. Putting students into the classroom with the right texts and the right professors in and of itself does not fix these fundamental problems that students don't trust each other, that they censor themselves, and that their lives are really fragmented. So I see the downsides of all the co-curricular activities. I see the excesses, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because if the university today is not shaping the hearts of young people and integrating the heart and the mind, their hearts are going to be deformed. And as a Catholic and a Christian, if your heart is deformed, your mind isn't going to work the way God intended it to work, because we are integrated. We are not mind, body, and soul unless you understand the and as a union. We are all of those. And students are experiencing a tremendous fragmentation of their mind and their heart. So education has to unite those. And for that, for example, I've incorporated more trips in my classes, but now the trip isn't simply an experience that's emotional. It's an experience that's supposed to awaken the intellect, sharpen the intellect, challenge the intellect, right? So again, being able to frame and make the difficult choices about which extracurricular and co-curricular, you need a framework for that. And you need a framework of integration that shapes the extracurricular and the co-curricular. It doesn't jettison it, maybe narrows it for sure. But should we study music? Yes, we should study music. Should we sing? Oh, I actually think we should study music and sing, right? But the and singing part isn't an addendum. It's a part of learning music. Should we study nature? Yes, we should. Should we go out into nature and study it? Yes. I think the sciences need to come back under the liberal arts. And the method of studying sciences shouldn't only be in the laboratory, it should be in the world, right? So again, the classroom isn't the only place that students should be learning.
Michael, do you want to respond to that? I mean, I can, yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I like the point about if you only do the intellectual things, that the intellectual things might not work. That's a good challenge to somebody like me, because like recently I've been thinking, you know, maybe we should just almost model ourselves on like sort of European universities where we just have the academics, and for the rest of it, you have to fend for yourself. But I see Margarita's point. I want to think about this more. I have two worries, but of course, to say that just maybe describes the problems that need to be solved. It's not necessarily an objection, you know. So one of them is this: my sense is that a lot of young people today, including, maybe especially including young people who end up in colleges and universities, their lives are really run by adults already. They never really do stuff for themselves. They're being, you know, when I was a kid, we would just go out the door. My mom didn't really know where we were going, and we would just disappear for hours at a time. But now you arrange play dates, and the kids are like always super supervised and stuff like that. And so I worry a little bit about continuing this model where instead of kids staying up till the middle of the night talking about the meaning of life, someone from the Department of Intellectual Affairs arranges a thing where they have to sit down and talk about something that they're told to talk about. I'm a little bit worried about that. So that's like a danger to be avoided, if it's to be avoided. And the other thing is, if you actually want to have a program or a set of programs that are aimed at, so to speak, forming the heart, you're either going to have a lot more faculty to do it, like a lot more, and not all faculty are well suited to doing this, or you're going to have, so to speak, the student life professionals. And I'm not so sure that your typical student life professional nowadays has this kind of orientation. Like there's a way of thinking about student life where you're basically running a cruise ship, and it just happens to be the case that the cruise ship has a bunch of classrooms. So I don't know how easy it would be to get this sort of student life side of things integrated into the intellectual thing. I admit it sounds like a very big change.
Yeah, look, let me interject here, because this is where I see, this is what prompted my question, right? And this is where I see potential disagreement between the two of you, or where we may have like talked past each other a little bit, right? So I would guess that Michael agrees, Margarita, with you about the integration that you described, right? And I know that I would. In fact, what we do at the IHE is precisely to try to reintegrate things that have been disintegrated in the way you described at the very beginning by the developments of majors and so on. But in a way, the question is, can integration occur with subordination or hierarchy? You know, if you recall what Michael said, part of what he was resisting was the notion that everything is equal, right? But that, you know, and instead what he was advancing was the idea that, you know, the academic side of the house, actually, that's the purpose of the thing, right? And if that's the purpose of the thing, then one might say integration will happen, right? But it will happen, with that prioritized, and so moon bounces and dining and so on will be a part of that. Caring for the full person will be a part of that, but it'll be at a university at least oriented towards the academic life. And in a way, what I was thinking is part of what you described in the kind of division between those places, those universities that pursue the liberal arts, you may see exactly what Michael's describing. At other places, you might see something a little bit more like the older model, the college experience model that I alluded to. Hey, football is why I'm at, I hate to single out any university, right? But it's why I'm at Auburn or whatever, right? It's right. That's why I'm there, and right. It provides a really good education as well. But it's I want that kind of experience. In a way, we have that sometimes already, right? Certain St. John's College you mentioned, University of Chicago, right? Typically a student is going to go there thinking, I'm not going there for its basketball. It may have basketball, right? But I'm going there because that's a life of the mind school. So can you have integration, in other words, with hierarchy, or are you guys really disagreeing, at that point? Does that make sense?
I think there's a lot of agreement in what we're saying. I think what I'm trying to emphasize is that emphasizing the academic still begs the question, what do you mean by academic and which academics? And what I'm suggesting is that we shouldn't separate out teaching music theory and singing music.
Sure.
And therefore, we shouldn't equate academic with sitting in the classroom for lectures of a specific amount of time. Now, certainly not all faculty are good at reaching the heart, but when we start to get down to the practical, right, there's the big vision and then there's the practical. Every university has its entrenched groups, but what I have seen since my time as a student is really the explosion of these centers appended to campuses that offer to integrate the mind and the heart. The Christian Studies Center movements amongst evangelicals, what do? They're forming the head and the heart together because they recruit people to run study groups that meet over dinner and pray together and sing together. And guess what? That is academic, but it's in an integrated way. They have founded residential communities at Cornell. On a smaller scale, you see students at Princeton University requesting substance-free dorms, requesting dorm life that has a routine in it, right? What if there was a deacon on each dorm floor that created bonds of solidarity and study halls, right? Is that academic? I think it's both and. And so what I'm saying is, let's not use hierarchy to mean that in order to be academic, you're neglecting the heart. But when you say hierarchy, that's how some people are going to hear it. And I think unless we have a framework where academic includes what Maritain calls poetic knowledge, the soul expressing itself in its world, academic isn't only rational, conceptual knowledge. And frankly, that's true for science too. So the head is also poetic knowledge, literature, arts, the fine arts. That's academic.
Okay, great. Michael, you want to respond?
Yeah, if we had a lot of time, we could thrash out precise distinctions among, hierarchy, subordination, teleology, and all of these things. And that sounds extremely fun, but I think it would sort of take us off track a little bit. So I agree with, I think I agree with a lot of what's being said here.
Why don't I sharpen the question?
Yeah.
Why don't I, or put you both on the spot? Okay.
Yeah. And you want us to disagree on something?
No, I don't.
I'm joking.
I am not interested in disagreement for its own sake. Well, I want to try to make this both a little bit more concrete, right? So both of you have thought a lot about education. Michael, I know because of our relationship, as colleagues, that you helped work on the university's core curriculum, right? And I guess what I would like to see you both answer is, what do you consider ideal components of a well-functioning curriculum at a university? Okay, so and feel free to name, it ought to include X, Y, and Z, or if it doesn't have X, it's not well functioning. Okay, so Michael, why don't you take that crack first? Perhaps it's freshest in your mind since, again, you did work on our curriculum.
Yeah, okay, and when you say ideal, like it can be a bit of a fantasy plane at this point.
Yeah, sure,
Yeah,
of course,
yeah.
right.
Okay. I think that, first of all, I think just a sort of literal curricular integration is kind of a good thing. So, like steps should be taken. They don't have to be extreme steps to get, when the students are studying philosophy and theology and literature and history and all, that these things are related to one another somehow. I think that's a good thing. I think another thing that's good is simply for some times in their course of studies, they're all doing the same thing or similar. Like when I look around campus and I see that, scores of kids are walking around all carrying a copy of the Nicomachean Ethics, because this is the part of the semester where pretty much all the philosophy courses are at Aristotle. To me, that's a good look, because everybody has a common thing that they can talk about. I used to live in a small town that had one movie screen. And one thing that was good about this is there was only one movie to watch. And then where if you have one of these multiplexes, then everybody watches their own movie, the one that they like. And then there's nothing to talk about. So I think that like forcing everyone to take the same stuff is good. Now, a little bit more idealistically, I think it would be nice if the faculty were, in some sense that I have trouble articulating, closer to the students. If they sort of spent more time with them. Now, this is a difficult thing to work out. On a practical level, many faculty are already crushed for time. So to ask them to do more stuff along these lines, it's just not realistic. So that's a problem. Another problem is just there will be a lot of mutual awkwardness on both sides. And how you overcome that, I'm not really sure, but I think it's worth trying. I had a fourth point, but I can't remember what it is.
Well, that's great stuff. Margarita, how about you?
Great. Well, in Scala, in the book that I have forthcoming, it's called The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts. We discuss with Roosevelt Montas, who is the director of the Columbia Core curriculum. He goes over the sort of basic components that have remained largely unchanged in the core curriculum at Columbia: philosophy, history, humanities, ancient and contemporary. I've seen what Catholic U put together for its core. I think it's fantastic. I'm working with a business school in Chile, South America, that has adopted a version of the Columbia core almost entirely. So I actually think when you sit scholars down in the room and ask them the ideal question, what would you teach? It's going to come out pretty close to what Columbia has and to what Catholic U has. So in some ways, the comments I've been making are perhaps an add-on to that, or perhaps in schools that aren't close to adapting that, what do you do practically speaking? And the point that I was trying to make, which I still think there's a couple things that I think often get left out. They're implied by the core curriculums at Columbia and Catholic U, but I don't think I can emphasize enough that science should be taught as a liberal art, right? Oftentimes the liberal arts means humanities, which means science is taught from a 19th or 20th century perspective exclusively as experimentation and lab, right? And what I'm saying is that science as a liberal art also includes learning from nature as a living book, which is, I think, what the Benedictines do, and also what the educator Charlotte Mason does. That's been adopted by a lot of classical homeschoolers for teaching science, right? So science is a liberal art. I have my PhD in the social sciences, and the social sciences have gradually moved more into the language, the narrow reductionist language of scientism than they have, and they've moved themselves away from the rich anthropological ethnographic roots of the disciplines that show human beings alive in history. So the social sciences have become more and more quantitative and more abstract. I think, frankly, on a really narrow understanding of what science is. So if we can't get science back into the liberal arts, we're not going to get the social scientists. And what are people majoring in the Ivy Leagues, at least where I am? They're majoring in politics and economics. So again, we can have the core, and even if all these universities pass the core tomorrow, students are still going to value science, technology, economics, and we have to be able to show them why the core, which if call it a hierarchy if you want, but then you're going to be imposing it on them. Why does it matter to them? And this is precisely what I'm trying to help this business school in Chile do. The students actually love the core liberal arts, and they finish it not knowing how it's related to being a good business person. And of course that can be addressed, right? But there's this tremendous presupposition students have that what their careers are going to be is unrelated to the liberal arts. So again, I just keep talking about the integration, because if you don't have the integration, you can't sustain the student engagement with what the core is. And so I think the faculty and the board of trustees and the president have to get on board and yes, use their authority and say, look, we are educators. This is what the curriculum needs to contain. But there also has to be this second part of addressing where students are coming from, integrating questions of the heart, questions of immersion in the world, and helping really build up the enthusiasm and the motivation from the students to integrate, to do the hard work of integrating whatever their vocational calling is with the liberal arts.
Yeah, please, Michael.
So two responses. One of them is just this. Maybe I need to hear more about what you were saying about science, but I've been in discussions where people say, oh, we need to get students more interested in science. And it turns out what they're really talking about is science courses where kids who are good at humanities and are bad at math and science, where they can get an A too. So like science is really hard, organic chemistry is really hard, physics requires calculus, and I don't know calculus. So let's have a course where other people, yeah, they're doing quantum mechanics, but I can go out and look at phases of the moon and then read poetry, and that's science too. And I think I'm not utterly opposed to what you're saying, but I'm a little bit worried about that this will amount to just a kind of lowering of academic standards for the sake of humanities students who just can't cut it in the sciences. And we have to just face up to the fact we're not that good at science, but other people are. So that's a sort of objection, if you wish, or a worry. Then I just want to make a comment about the relation of humanities types of learning to people's careers. I wish there was a way to get people to understand that just because they will probably never get a chance to quote a Wordsworth sonnet in a business meeting doesn't mean that all their time is being wasted. And it's partly, of course, because like their soul is being enlarged, and that's a great thing. But also just the mere fact that they're learning to think and read and write more carefully, it's going to pay off. It's not always clear, but you can tell when you're in a meeting and you're in the hands of somebody who has a well-organized mind, then you have a good meeting. And when they're just totally scatterbrained and they're all over the place, like then everybody's time is being wasted. And that's in a way a function of education. There's a funny way in which if you take good courses and have good extracurricular discussions and all, you will grow into a person with a powerful, organized mind. And then that will make you way better in business or medicine or whatever, even if you're not literally drawing on it.
Any thoughts on that, Margarita?
Well, briefly, I would say that students in hindsight who've completed the core curriculum, I've heard from my colleague Roosevelt Montes at Columbia, they all essentially express what you just say, that in hindsight, they see how it has prepared them to be successful for all the reasons you're saying. Same thing with the business school in Chile. However, that still doesn't address the issue that some of them get unmotivated when they come in. So sort of how do we share that? How do we get the alumni to share that? How do we get business leaders to share that? And with science as a liberal art, I'd say we probably need a whole nother panel, but no, I'm not talking about making science yet another A that people can get without an offering. What I'm saying, I'm drawing on my experience, for example, with the Princeton engineering department. that has an initiative on engineering and beauty, right? And I'm drawing on my uncle, who's a famous geoscientist, the idea that we learn about science by doing things in the world, and a kind of liberal arts approach to the natural world as open-ended, as exploring, as having creativity, and not only doing science education as you described it, which is having people sit down and memorize orgo and memorize calculus. There's a place for that, but science majors and engineering schools lose a certain subset of people because of the narrow methodological way that science is taught. That's what I meant. Teaching high levels of science in a liberal arts fashion for the best scientists.
Look, I love that our conversation has already produced satellite conversations for us to work on down the line, Margarita, with you guys, including on science as a liberal arts piece. So let's move, however, to the questions of our audience. We are at that 2:40 mark. And our first question, Michael, actually is a former colleague of ours, Angela's, and it's directed to you. Angela Knoble asks, if we need to treat education as pursuing the truth together, should professors avoid expressing an opinion in class? I say this as someone who has felt pressured as a student to adopt my professor's views, and many students will say this, right? Many students will say, look, I feel like now I have to conform to the political views of my professor who, when she makes it available to us. So this pressure can be experienced in an unhealthy way. And someone who as a professor would like to share my views in a way that isn't unhealthy in that way. So if we're pursuing the truth together, first, Michael, should we professors avoid or embrace expressing our opinions in class?
This is a very hard question.
It is.
And I think it's hard in part because it has sort of multiple components, and it can't be completely separated from the personality and manner of the professor in question. Like some people are more domineering than others, for example. So one thing I want to say helps is that I think it can help to, maybe this is a fantasy, but I try to do this, let's put it that way. I try to talk to students about this a little bit explicitly. I'm not, like I had professors in college who just hid their views. We just didn't know what they thought. They were really good at that. And
Right.
I might try to emulate that, but it doesn't really fit with my personality. So I tell my students, I can't hide, I'm not really good at hiding my views. But I want to invite you to feel like you don't have to agree with me on things. So just to make a little bit of a theme out of it, I think probably helps a little. Now, of course, some of them are probably thinking, sure. I get that, that's a problem. But I think making a theme out of it can help a little bit. Another thing I think that's important is if you do think you should give your view on something, it's better to give it explicitly than to take it for granted. In other words, there's a way of shoving a view down someone's throat, and it consists precisely in not stating the view, but just assuming that it's true and saying all these other things. And that really almost, I mean, I don't know, maybe this is exaggerated language, but it sort of dehumanizes all the people who disagree. They are like non-participants in the conversation. I think that's a really bad thing to do. But the third thing I want to say is I think it's important a lot to stick to your knitting. So if I'm teaching a metaphysics class, it's much more appropriate for me to tell my students what I think about a certain argument about the problem of universals than it is for me to tell them my opinion on, the recent election or something like that, because we're not there to talk about the election. Just sometimes stuff comes up, I get that, but my impression is that like some people just make a habit of just sort of like bringing up their political views and making everybody talk about them. And that seems kind of narcissistic to me. Oh, and one more thing, when people do dare to disagree with you, the mighty professor, like bring them out, right? Act nice to them, restate their views so they can tell that you understood, say that's a good point, but here, this is, you know what I mean? Like there's ways to handle this. I don't know, but I think it's a very difficult problem.
It is, and so what I'm hearing is you're saying it's really a contextual response. It depends on who you are, some self-knowledge, right, and also the classroom and so on. Margarita, do you have any? You must have encountered this as well in your own teaching. Any thoughts on this?
I would briefly add that because I teach, topics in the social sciences, I've taught classes on race and economic inequality. I now shifted more to reading philosophy and theology to give me a better normative framework. But I try to address this question by giving a lot of student opportunity to write reaction papers to assignments, giving them a assigned time when they get to present in class, because I think in the end, what you're trying to do as a teacher is really elicit the student's own thoughts, because that's when you're going to have a more constructive engagement. So just thinking pedagogically how to get students to really engage deeply with issues. And then whether or not you agree with them, I think just becomes part of the dynamic of the classroom. But at a deeper philosophical level, here I would say I draw on The Risk of Education, a book by Luigi Giussani, which I assign in my classes on education and which I talk about in my forthcoming book, The Love of Learning. And I would say that the classroom is a risk. It's a risk for the teacher and it's a risk for the student. But Giussani says you don't hide your certainty from the students. You try to unpack it for them, how you got there, but you also try to accompany them as they unpack and perhaps change their own views. And this is a risky endeavor. So I have been challenged by students, and absolutely my views on things have evolved from reading student responses and from listening to them. But that doesn't mean that I don't come into the classroom knowing that I have certainty about certain things. And it doesn't make you a better scholar to not have reached certainty about whatever it is that you're teaching. It just doesn't. That's a kind of nihilism ultimately. And students, what I've also learned to do, and this is harder, I don't do this in the classroom. I don't talk about politics in the classroom, generally speaking. It's not germane to the topics I'm teaching. And I don't tell personal stories, but I'll tell you, outside of the classroom, I tell personal stories. I talk about, part of the reason I'm not a big fan of communist solutions to poverty is that, I went to Cuba 7 times in 1991, 2007, and I did months of field work in Haiti. And, Cuban communism is not going to solve Haitian poverty. And here's what I saw. Here are the people that I met with. Here are the dissidents I talked to, and compare them to the peasants that I met in Haiti. And so when people see that I've reached these positions, both about communism and about, frankly, God's transcendent love, which is a reality people in Haiti don't struggle with, when they hear me talk about my own personal experiences, they realize I didn't just get there by reading books. I got there by integrating the books I read with the life that I live, with the questions that I care about. And that just, it seems more authentic to them, whether they agree with me or not.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel like I'm trying to change them for the sake of changing them, but that I'm trying to share with them how I got to where I am.
Great. Okay. So, sorry, Michael.
Can I add a couple of things?
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I don't want to kill off all the other questions. Just very briefly, two other things that we're thinking about. I think if you're the professor or whatever, you should let the students know when you don't know. Like when you're uncertain about stuff, just say, I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know. And that, I think, tones down the dogmatism level in the whole class. Because it's not about always being certain, But the other thing is that it's important, not exclusively, but partly to remember that the students are there to learn about argumentation as well as conclusions. So even if they are giving the right answer, if they don't have a good argument for it, they aren't doing a really great job. And so you might have a student who knows all the right answers, but they're basically just giving you their talking points, and they're not doing a good job in your course. And likewise, another student may be giving all the wrong answers, but actually be very sophisticated at analysis and argumentation, and that's a kind of excellence. And when students realize that both of those are at issue, then the pressure to conform to the party line may decrease.
Great, thank you. Okay, so next question, Margarita, this one seems like you'd be particularly equipped to respond given your experience with the Chilean university that you spoke about. Michael, not that you couldn't also respond, but I think we'll start with Margarita. Patricia Craig asks, how practically speaking would large non-liberal arts universities incorporate a liberal arts core? Should this be something that larger universities really even aim at? Okay, and I think you addressed that a little bit in your opening comments, but
Sure.
thoughts on that?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question. And, I have actually spoken to the presidents who run some technical colleges whose degrees are going to be in nursing assistant or truck driving. Hey, they want to have some liberal arts component. What do they want? They want maybe a 2 or 3 day seminar on character development. They want maybe a 2 or 3 day seminar on, financial literacy, so basics of economics, right? They want their graduates to be adult human beings who are fully formed human persons and are going to work in healthcare or truck driving. So the question then becomes, to have a liberal arts education in a non-liberal arts university, how do you do it, right? And so these are just some things that I'm thinking about. But look, character development, life skills, economics, like this is all part of the liberal music. Even how do you deliver that in a economical way, but also in a way for people who are really busy? I mean, as the one president of one of these technical schools said to me, look, the students who come to my school, they're quite literally trying to put food on the table for their families. How am I going to convince them that they need to study music or something? And the commonality we had was that, are you saying that because someone works in healthcare as a nurse's assistant or a truck driver that they don't desire a good, fulfilling human life? Of course they do. They desire the goods that a liberal arts education upholds. The question is, how do you provide a kind of integral human formation in a reduced way where they're not going to be spending 40 hours a week on it, but maybe they can spend 40 minutes, right? And maybe there's creative ways. And we discussed this a little bit in some of my webinars online, but to come away with the idea that the only way to have a liberal arts education is a 4-year degree in it is a mistake. We need to be thinking about all of the other people for whom this approach to education is about forming their soul, and it's about forming integrated human beings. And that's why we need to bring this discussion in another webinar to K-12, to technical education. But yes, it can be done. And it must be.
Look, and that answer, your answer there just really actually leads right into the next question. And I'm going to stay with you, Margarita, on it. And Michael, you can join in too. Peter Rebello asks, is the university too late to form our children in the way you just described, Margarita? If they've not been virtue-led in high school or not been sort of formed in virtue in high school, is it too late at the university level? And is that why you're focusing on K-12?
Well, look, I would say that we definitely should be taking these ideas to the K-12 level. But let me also say, because I work in higher ed, students are at the age of 18 when they get here, and frankly, even graduate students who might be young graduate students in their early 20s, they're still being formed, and they may not be even posing some of these deeper questions until they're a little bit older. So if they haven't had it, of course, if they've had it, it's easier to continue it. Yeah. But there's no way in which the model of education that I believe in, or my faith as a Catholic, is somehow limited to people who grew up with that. I was fortunate to grow up with that. But I think Catholics and Christians in education have got to be missionaries here. Do you know, and I'm sure you know, it's probably why you're asking the question, do you know how bad the mental illness crisis is, especially at elite schools? Do you not think, I'm just saying rhetorically, those students are looking for a vision, and they're looking for hope, and they're looking for a guide. And I think that the truth is always attractive. Is there hard work to be done with a student who has attempted suicide or who has taken time off because of suicide? Absolutely there is. But those students, some of them are going to come to their professors, or they're going to come to their schools, and they're going to be looking for an alternative way. And we need to think about, what does it take to invest in the students who are trying to turn around and walk away from the mind and soul numbing forms of entertainment, from the wrong messages they've been given about their human dignity, from the misuses of their body in a number of ways. And how do we present liberal arts education, to use Pope Francis's metaphor, also as a field hospital for people whose education hasn't provided that to them. Yes, we need to do that.
Great, great. Here's a question, Michael, we'll start with you on this one from Nathaniel Urban. He says that you and Dr. Mooney, Dr. Gorman and Dr. Mooney mentioned how COVID caused immense pressure on universities to sell students a practical message. How in the post-COVID era can universities sell students a learning for the sake of learning message? Okay, Michael?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so on the one level, I think that there already are students who want this. And it's important to remember, like, people, with responsibility for the futures of universities run the risk of sort of panicking and thinking, oh my gosh, everybody wants practical stuff. Let's just give everyone practical stuff because that's what people want nowadays. And you can panic and miss the fact that you've got significant numbers of students already who want traditional learning for the sake of learning. Also, you could actually direct your marketing. In admissions, you could try to find those students out there in the great masses of high school juniors and seniors and reach out to them directly. Another point is that if your university or your college has some required liberal artsy courses early on, students can find for themselves, oh, this is more interesting than I thought. So you have students who start out majoring in something super practical, but then they change their minds and they decide, to do something much less practical, and they have to go home and tell their parents and go through all of that. But that can happen. So in other words, one thing you can do, it's not exactly selling it. I don't want to overreact to the metaphor of selling. You can present it and make it available, but partly that does go to how you teach it, right? If you take okay, let's say you want all the freshmen to read Homer. Now you could send a super philologically oriented expert in classics in there to beat them over the head about all the different verb forms, and a small number of students will be thrilled, but you don't hook people in that way. So there's a question of making sure there's a shallow end to the pool.
Yeah, can I just follow up with you, Michael, a little bit? Would you say that because you described the student who might come in, let's say for a business degree or something very practically oriented, who might be awakened by the right teacher or the right material to this desire for knowledge for its own sake. Maybe Margarita, you can answer this as well. Do you both think that's actually a natural desire, and in a way part of our obligation as university teachers and university administrators is to try to awaken that desire for learning for its own sake? So Michael, I just wanted you to, because you touched on it, and then Margarita.
I do think it's a natural desire. I just want to be, I don't mean by that the natural teleology of every human being is to become a philosophy major. So some of those students are, you weren't saying that, but I just want to clarify this. Some of the students are going to stay in their business major, but it's going to proceed in a different way.
Right.
Once that desire to learn for its own sake gets awakened in them. And I think it's actually quite important that we try to do that.
Okay, great. Margarita, what do you think?
Hey, look, briefly, there's a way in which liberal education, as we're describing it, you most know that you want it because you've experienced it. But then it brings us back to Joe's point that, we do have to, or Michael has said this too, we also have to model it for people, and we have to, make people excited about it. It is part of our job. So when it comes to actually filling seats in a liberal arts school, it's going to be hard just on a piece of paper to sell it to people who haven't experienced it. At the same time, yes, I do think there's a natural desire to it. So the Chilean university I'm working with, the Adolfo Ibanez is the name of it. Someone asked, they have to sell this, right? And I think they are selling it. And I think that there's a way in which it can be done. Also with Scala, I try to quote unquote sell this vision, but the best way to sell it is to have people participate, but it doesn't mean that you can't find the concepts and the examples and the ways to show the long-term impact on students. I just think that some people aren't gonna accept that message if they haven't themselves experienced it.
Great. So here's another question, which is a kind of follow-up, Michael, and it's directed to you. But again, Margarita, I think you've said things that are germane to it, but we'll start with Michael. The person writes, I really like the point that the poverty of contemporary political debate illustrates a failure of education. And that was a point, Michael, you made earlier. How do we cure it, is the question. Is reading Aristotle enough? Well, point to things that will help us address this. Obviously, you won't cure it. I understand that.
Yeah. Well, okay, so this is related in an important way to something that Margarita said near the outset, and I hope that comes out, and if it doesn't, then she should jump in. So I do think that it is partly a question of what they're taught, but on the other hand, it's important how things are taught. So they have to see what it looks like when someone is trying to figure out what the answer is, which is different from someone is trying to get their talking points past you. And that's just a really, like, it's useful to just pay attention to things that people say from this perspective. You see people giving arguments that are bad arguments, and they have to know in their hearts that these are bad arguments, but they're arguments with the right conclusion. So they just keep shoveling them at you, and you just realize you're being, it's like you're subjected to an advertising campaign. And we have to make sure that we don't do anything like that at all. And in fact, we sort of counter it. So, and that engages the fact that there's a moral side to this. Like, you have to desire the truth. It's being intelligent is not enough. You actually have to want the truth itself. And so this is already a kind of formation of the heart, really. And Margarita said a thing that I had not thought of, and I was really glad to hear it. Like, if you're in a place where the students don't trust each other, that's a big problem. So if you need to create, this is probably worse at some schools than others, where you may just have a lot of like mutual suspicion, and something has to break through that. And it's not ordinarily, I mean, it's certainly not going to be reading Aristotle, right? It's going to be a barbecue or something like that. And they can discover these people are human too.
Great. Margarita, any thoughts? Okay, good. Okay. So Margarita, I'll put this question to you from James Matthews. He writes, as a parent of a high school senior who wanted him to attend a college with a great books core curriculum, I found fewer colleges offer that than when I was in college. I was more likely to find mandatory anti-racism courses required than great books. Does the panel think this trend, and I assume he means the trend away from great books-oriented curricula or core curricula, has been accelerated by COVID and other social developments? I think to some extent you talked about this at the outset, Margarita, but why don't you maybe flesh that out a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I know the American Council of Trustees and Alumni keeps close watch on the content of curriculum and publishes a list of schools that have essentially a great books core curriculum. I know there's such a thing as the Newman Guide that also assesses Catholic education. What I've seen anecdotally, again, I haven't seen the numbers on this, but everyone seems to be doing similar things to what Princeton Theological Seminary and Princeton University have been doing, with a push to incorporate really diversity and inclusion as a criteria in the curriculum. I think the most recent expression of that is the anti-racism, but the larger move in the curriculum has been around diversity and inclusion. That's been with us for quite a while. Now, I would like to argue that diversity and inclusion by no means you have to undo the core curriculum, right? There's certainly a way in which the core curriculum can represent traditions of the East that were not as separate from the West as sometimes we like to think. There are ways in which, if we're going to broaden the curriculum to include, let's say, more Asian studies programs, I would argue we should study the best works of classical Chinese civilization. I have a colleague who does that with schools in China, teaches the Western core alongside the Chinese core, right? We could do diversity by picking the most excellent works from whatever culture we think is really important to study. Unfortunately, diversity and inclusion often has gotten separated from academic excellence. And I don't think that that needs to be the case. I think you can have diversity and inclusion and read the best literature and philosophy from Latin America. You can read the best knowledge that has been produced in Africa, right? So we just need to retain this criteria of excellence. The anti-racist programs, I think, are trying to do a big sweep of really complex topics. And I teach really complex topics in my classes. I teach books on slave religion by Al Rabateau. I teach my own book that deals with racism and hate and slavery in Haiti. I teach books about the history and the sociology of America and all the complex questions around immigration and diversity. So I don't have a problem with those topics being broached. I would like them to be broached in a complex way. And I think whatever the topic is, when suddenly, we have a curriculum that's one size fits all, it goes really broad brushstrokes, it's not clear to me what kind of formation that's actually giving.
Any thoughts on that, Michael? Or, I mean, you don't have to, but I'm just wondering.
Well, maybe now I'm just starting to repeat early things I was saying before, but part of the difficulty with some versions of these recent discussions of race and inclusion and all is just the extremely high emotional temperature of the whole thing. And it creates a space where you're not actually allowed to be puzzled and wonder, wait, why? What exactly is happening and why is it happening? There are preset answers that you're sort of obliged to hold. And by the way, this is something that can happen for both sides, right? It's not just like quote unquote left-wingers are doctrinaire, unlike all the free-thinking right-wing people. Because like, if you pay attention to debates, you have a lot of people on both sides who already know the answers before the conversation begins. And again, like if we could just sort of try to show people what it's like to be open-minded and to wonder about these complex things and it's okay to be puzzled.
This seems, this element of the conversation seems itself like another panel, right? I mean, something that it merits, really being dignified by a longer conversation. But I think you both have touched on the way that topical subjects challenge the pursuit of truth that we've all described in a different way than subjects that are more or less historical, if we describe them that way. And I think it's interesting that often as we think about like whatever the hottest, highest tension subject is in our culture, people will use the language, well, you're on the wrong side of history, right? If you think this or that. But I find that really suggestive, right? That language of history at that point, because it suggests, as a kind of conclusion to the thing that we're living in the midst of. And as we all know, it's very difficult to have a perspective on something that you're living in the midst of, So, right, this is what makes this particularly challenging, especially when you add into this everything we all have said about creating a community of trust, right, in your classroom, where people can speak openly and where you're puzzled, as Michael said, and where you're concerned in the way, Margarita, you described, to bring the whole heart, not merely the mind. It's not merely theoretical, but you're trying to bring, the full person into these questions. So I think that in a way, that's a very good last question for us to have kind of wrangled with in our conversation today, because it suggests, on the one hand, a kind of open-endedness to this conversation, right? It's not going anywhere. Universities are shaking themselves out too, right? And many of these problems that were raised by that excellent last question, we're in the middle of them, and they are themselves vexing the way we educate and the way we pursue understanding. So I just want to thank you both. I mean, you guys were really, really wonderful. I thought you were both, you exhibited humility. You exhibited, the capacity yourselves to disagree, right? I mean, there was disagreement that I was not intentionally trying to provoke, right? It just was there, and it was fun. But it was nonetheless fruitful for our conversation. And like I also said, we had plenty of places where we can direct this in the future. So, Michael, thanks so much for joining us. Margarita, thank you, and thanks Scala for co-hosting this with us. I mean, this was really a lot of fun. I think, again, there's a lot more work for us to do moving forward. Guests, audience, thank you guys so much for your fantastic questions. We invite you to listen to this conversation and past events on our YouTube channel, which I'm not quite sure how you find, but maybe you just Google IHE YouTube channel or something. Please visit our website. That I know it's ihe.catholic.edu. Please visit our website. Perhaps that has more information for these things. Our next event is coming up on Friday when Emmett McGroarty will be working with the wonderful people at the Faith and Law for a Friday forum. That will feature Emmett and Stanley Kurtz and Wilfred McClay on the struggle over American civics and history education in the United States. So again, thanks to everybody. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you next time.